On one side, I'm pretty optimistic about the market because Trump won the presidency, and there are a lot of reasons why the stock market could potentially grow in the next couple of years. But on the other side, there is this crisis that is looming around the corner, and if it gets out of hand, it could potentially destroy the stock market. It will have devastating consequences on the economy overall, and when it comes to the stock market, the impacts of that is going to be significantly bigger than that. And I can't just ignore it. I have to talk about it. Now, I don't want to tell you what will happen to the market or what will not happen to the market. What I will do in this video is that I'm just going to explain the crisis to you. I'm going to talk about the potential consequences and the reasons behind that. And by the end of the video, you just can decide for yourself how big that crisis is. And you will know for a fact that it's not something that we can simply ignore. Now, if you take a look at the US economy, you will realize that it mostly consists of the companies out there. And if you actually take a look at the S&P 500, now S&P 500 is just literally a combination of combination of most powerful companies in the United States. And we are talking about companies such as Apple, Microsoft, and these are just some of the largest companies out there. I mean, you can also include in those companies Alphabet and more. And the overall valuation of the S&P 500 is around $42 trillion. And to be honest, that is a lot of money, like $42 trillion. Now, if you take $42 trillion and take a look at the total valuation of the US stock market, it's like $54 trillion. So the S&P 500, even though that it's just the top 500 companies, these top 500 companies represent more than 80% of the entire stock market of the United States. And the US stock market is the most advanced financial system ever existed in history, and it's literally incomparable compared to the rest of the world. So anything that's going to happen to the S&P 500, it is going to not just collapse the US economy, but its impacts are going to go way beyond the US borders. And if you actually take a look at all of those companies that we see over here, you will realize that almost half of them, especially the largest companies there, are under antitrust investigation, which means that the government of the United States is looking at all of those companies, especially when we talk about companies such as Apple, Microsoft, Alphabet, Meta, and more. And the government is like, we should break up those companies because those companies got so big that we no longer have control over them. And when we don't have control over them, they can literally just monopolize the entire industry, which they already did. And for those reasons, we have enough reasons based on the Constitution to break them down into different companies. Let me give you some examples. Now, take a look, for example, at Apple. Now, according to the US Justice Department, Apple has monopolized the App Store and Apple Music. And these are some of the major sources of revenue for a company like Apple. Now, Apple, one of the largest companies out there, especially in the United States, where most people actually use iPhones. And now the Justice Department looks at Apple and they're like, we gotta break up this company. And breaking up Apple is going to have devastating consequences on the evaluation of Apple. Right now, Apple worth around like $3 to $3.5 trillion. And if it will be broken up, it's very likely that it will not worth $3.5 trillion. Of course, the opposite could also happen, where all of those companies individually might worth more, but we can't really guarantee that. It doesn't mean that something like that is going to happen. Now, let's take another example. Take a look at the Amazon. It's not just the United States, but the EU as well is accusing Amazon of unfair practices in the marketplaces. So what the Amazon basically does is that they have taken their entire platform, which is the marketplace, and everybody can sell everything they want on that marketplace. And Amazon carefully watches what is being sold the best on their marketplace. For example, if a certain product is getting more popular and the competition behind it is getting extremely strong, Amazon can come up with an extremely similar product and they will just sell it at a lower price until they will drive out of business the competition, and it's going to be the only product that is sold there on Amazon, and the only person who's going to make a profit out of it is Amazon itself. Just like, for example, Apple. Now, everybody who gets into the Apple Store, if you build your, let's say, application and you will be selling it on Apple Store for iPhone users out there, you're going to pay a 30% tax on whom? Exactly, Apple. Now, nobody can compete, for example, with Apple Music because every single iPhone out there gets with a pre-installed Apple Music. Now, I can give you more examples, such as, for example, Meta. I don't think anybody will disagree with me here that Meta has a complete monopoly on social media, especially when it comes to a country like the United States. Because what do you use? You probably use Facebook, Instagram, and I think they have also purchased a few other companies out there that made them the most popular social media company out there. Yes, there is competition that comes up from Snapchat. But that competition is very minimal. I mean, the number of people who actually use Snapchat is nothing compared to the number of users who use Instagram, especially when Instagram simply copied everything that Snapchat was popular for. The only competition that Meta got was from TikTok, but Facebook or Meta overall lobbied strongly in the US government in order to ban TikTok in the United States. Of course, they tried to purchase TikTok in the first place because TikTok is a Chinese company. Yes, they have actually created a separate company outside the United States, outside China, in order to compete globally, because the TikTok that exists in the US and the TikTok that exists in China are two different companies. And Meta wanted to purchase TikTok, and then they couldn't. And because of that, they tried their best in order to make sure that TikTok actually gets banned in the United States. Take Google, for example. Google is being sued for what? For Android? Take a look at every other phone that is not an iPhone. It has a pre-installed Android. Google Ads. If you don't count social media, for example, then Google has a complete monopoly when it comes to Google Ads. So if you actually zoom out and take a look at everything that is happening over here, you will realize that at least half of the S&P 500 is being under antitrust investigation. Half of the S&P 500 does not look like a lot, but if you kind of take a look at the valuations, you will realize that like the top 10 companies that represent the S&P 500, they are represent a third of the valuation of the S&P 500 because they are the world's largest companies out there. So half of the S&P 500 is like almost 70 or 80% of the entire valuation of the S&P 500. And you can clearly see that in the chart that I have right in front of me. Like Apple alone makes up around 8% of S&P 500, Microsoft around 7%. Then we have Alphabet, Amazon, and all of these companies are, not all of them, but most of these companies, besides probably like Berkshire Hathaway and maybe Tesla. I'm not really sure about Tesla. We can actually take a look at the numbers. But other than that, most of these companies are under antitrust investigations. And if they will be broken down, I don't really know what an impact they will have on the S&P 500, but I really doubt that impact is going to be extremely positive for the markets. Now, first of all, most of these companies could lose their valuation. For instance, if you take a look at a company like Apple, they're worth over $3 trillion. And Apple has a very profitable department, such as, for example, they are selling iPhones. Their App Store is very profitable, and maybe selling MacBooks is extremely profitable. But on the other side, they have some departments out there or some products that are not as profitable, or maybe they're running at a huge loss. I can give you a very simple example. For instance, they have launched something called Apple TV, and they're actually pouring billions of dollars into creating shows and competing in the streaming industry. So if they break up, for example, the iPhone department from the Apple TV, there is no money to throw into Apple TV in order to compete in the streaming industry, because that department, that product, that thing is actually running at a loss. The only thing that allows Apple to compete on those industries is because they have other industries that are extremely profitable, and to a certain extent they are actually being very monopolistic. Maybe the same thing could be said about Google, the same thing could be said about Meta, about Amazon. So if they will be broken up, maybe those companies individually will worth a lot more than as if they are part of the big company right now. But most of that company will lose most of its valuation. Now, another thing is, of course, the competition with China. What you have to understand about modern economy is that we're being run not just by governments, by corporations that have trillions of dollars into their pockets, and they're having massive influence. So if you take a company, for instance, such as Apple, they're not just competing in the United States. Yes, Apple is a US company, but it's just partially a US company. It has been founded in the United States. But other than that, Apple is competing in the European Union, Apple is competing in China, Apple is competing in the entire Southeast Asia. Apple is everywhere. And they're facing serious competition from Chinese companies such as Huawei, for example, right? So if Apple will be broken up into multiple different companies, they will stand no chance to compete against a Chinese company that is being backed by the Chinese Communist Party, and they will not be broken up. That is why they will instantly lose competition globally in the entire world. They will not be able to offer the exact same services because a lot of those services are being run at a huge loss, and Apple is actually trying to make a bet that they will make a lot of money from those services sometime in the future. That future could be 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. And if they will be broken up, instantly Chinese companies with more deep pockets that are being backed by the Chinese government, they will instantly replace Apple. And Apple is just one example. Now, another example is, of course, they will not be able to grow as much as they are growing right now. What you have to understand about all of those companies that are being under antitrust regulations is that they are growing because they have other sources of revenue. Now, let me give you an example of Amazon. Now, a lot of people, when they think of Amazon, they think of a marketplace. Amazon is one of the first marketplaces that ever existed in the world, and that's what Jeff Bezos actually did. So he started Amazon and he started selling books. Then he started selling CDs. And slowly, Amazon turned into a place where you can sell absolutely everything that you want out there, right? But if you want to actually go deep into Amazon, you will realize that what fueled their growth initially was that back in the 1990s, Jeff Bezos realized that they need servers in order for the Amazon website to function properly. So they created a separate business, what they called Amazon Web Services, where they provided servers for their Amazon, and also they started renting servers for other companies out there. And slowly that department actually became so profitable that the money was taken from Amazon Web Services and was fueled in order to grow the marketplace that we know Amazon today. And the exact same thing is happening with every other company out there. Meta is taking the company, for example, the money that they made from Facebook, and they purchased what they have purchased, like Instagram. They invested into different companies. Now they are investing in augmented reality. So if you actually take a look at any of those companies, that's how they grow. So if you actually break them out, they will not be able to do something like that again. So their growth will actually stop. And all those companies, for example, right now, I mean, if you take any tech company right now, they're competing everywhere. For example, take the streaming industry. You have Amazon with their Amazon Prime, you have Apple with Apple TV, and then you have a bunch of every other company out there that is getting into that business in the first place. But the main question that we want to ask ourselves is that, does the United States have a history of breaking up previous companies? Because is the US government just bluffing? But if they actually did something like that in the past, if the US government actually broke up some of these companies out there, then they are serious about something like that. So let's take a look at the history of the United States. Not the history, just a few examples, just to illustrate the point how serious the US government is at breaking up those huge companies that the government is accusing them of being a monopoly. Now, the most famous example is probably AT&T. Now, AT&T is one of the first companies that ever existed in the United States that still exists up until today because it was founded back in 1885. And that's when telegraphs was actually created. And the company quickly grew up and dominated the entire telecommunication industry. But in order to get into this business, you have to invest tons of money, hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars in order to get into this industry, because you have to build the entire infrastructure that would allow you to provide telecommunication services. So if a new startup would want to come into this business, they will have to build that entire infrastructure to be able to provide that services. And AT&T simply can lower down their prices in order to stop them from doing something like that. Imagine you get into a competition with AT&T in any state out there. But you cannot do that because AT&T is going to lower down prices, and then you look at your investment and you will recover your money 30 years from now, 40 years from now. Not a single investor will actually agree to do something like that. Suddenly, you won't actually compete with AT&T. And that's why the Justice Department decided that AT&T is a monopoly, and after years of battles in the courtrooms, they agreed to break up AT&T into multiple different companies, and that happened in 1982, which is as recent as 45 years ago, something like that. Now, another famous example, and you probably heard about this example, is Standard Oil. This was one of the largest oil companies, not just in the United States. It was the largest in the US, but it was one of the largest that ever existed in history. It was founded by a guy named John D. Rockefeller. And Rockefeller was the guy who actually, back in the late, probably 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, John D. Rockefeller started an oil business. So he kind of built his first refinery, and he made that refinery extremely profitable. He took the money from that refinery, instead of actually spending it on himself, he purchased another refinery and made it also extremely profitable. And instead of wasting that money, he purchased a third refinery. And over time, he started purchasing more and more refineries, and more and more money started flowing into the business. And at some point, he realized that he owns over 90% of all the refineries. And if I'm not mistaken, at the peak of Standard Oil, they controlled more than 97 or 98% of the entire industry. Of course, he could actually go ahead and get 100% of the entire industry, but it would be a clear monopoly that he took over the entire industry, because he had court battles with the US government for decades, if I'm not mistaken. But at some point, the government decided enough is enough. We are going to break up Standard Oil into 34 different companies. And that's exactly what they did in the last century. And you realize that in every single state where there was Standard Oil, it was turned into an independent, separate business out there. For example, there was a Standard Oil in Ohio. There was a Standard Oil in California. There was a Standard Oil in every other industry there. But the interesting thing about it is that those companies individually couldn't actually survive. And over time, they kind of merged together and turned into 4 different companies that we know today. Chevron, which is one of the most popular companies, ExxonMobil, BP, British Petroleum, and Marathon Oil. So even though that the government broke these companies out, over time they realized that as 34 different companies, it's really difficult for them to grow. So they started merging one after another. And right now, those 34 companies now 4 different companies. So when the government actually says in the US that we want to break up any company, they are being extremely serious about it. And if they can actually prove it in the courtrooms, they can actually break it up. And that is why we want to ask ourselves a very simple question. Why do they want to break up so many companies in the first place? Why do they want to break up Apple? Why do they want to break up Amazon? And the reasons behind that are very simple and straightforward. And the arguments they're making is extremely strong. Now, first of all, it's of course a monopoly. And monopolies are illegal, and they're illegal in most of the world, including the United States. So if there are clear signs that a single company is a monopoly, like Standard Oil dominated the oil refinery industry in the United States. So when you control 98% of the entire market, you are a monopoly. That is really bad for the country. For instance, if you take Google, for example, if you don't count social media, can you name me a single different company that can compete with Google on online ads? Absolutely not. So if take Meta, for instance, Meta started or tried back in the days in order to purchase, what do you call that company? Snapchat, but they couldn't. If they actually purchased Snapchat, they would not have any competition at all. So despite the fact that Snapchat wasn't purchased by Meta in the first place, Snapchat represents a tiny portion of the market. And right now they are trying their best in order to destroy TikTok. The same thing could be said about Apple. The same thing could be said about Google and other companies out there. The problem with monopolies is that they stop innovation, and that is something that the government does not want. Because if you're actually building a business, the best business out there is for you to have a monopoly. Because if you don't have a monopoly and you have competition, and now you have to compete, you have to put money into research and development, you have to throw money into lowering down your prices, you have to hire more people, you have to compete. But when you have a monopoly, you just sit down there and you just enjoy how the profits get into you. You don't have to innovate. You don't have to throw trillions of dollars into building a new product. Why? Because you have a monopoly. So for a business person, a monopoly is great. But for consumers, a monopoly is really bad. Because for instance, if you have like a single company that is selling, let's say, cars, they can charge whatever price they think is the best, right? They can charge $50,000, $100,000, and you have no other choice. You're going to buy that car. But if you have like 20 different companies selling cars, for instance, then there is competition. So every single car company will try to lower down their prices, improve their qualities, offer you better service, and you are going to choose the one that offers you the best offer out there. And that's why competition is good for the consumers and it's really bad for business owners. And because the Justice Department has to care about innovation in the country, they want to break up companies that monopolize any industry out there. Now, another thing is, of course, data privacy. And this is by far one of the most important things because it's not just a matter of competition or prices, but it's a matter of national security. Let me give you a very simple example. If you take a look at all of those companies that are being under antitrust investigation, you'll find out that most of them, if not all of them, are tech companies. And the main job of the tech companies is to gather data, feed it to their algorithm, improve their algorithm, and beat the competition. That's how they actually win in the market. So they have all the data about every single US citizen. They have more data than the US government has. Some of them probably have more data than CIA has. Now, they have no problem about the fact if that data is going to be leaked, for example, to CIA or FBI or any other government agency. But the main concern is that what if the data that Apple has about every single US citizen will be leaked to different foreign governments, such as a communist country such as China? Now, they will know a lot about US citizens, and they can actually use that against the United States, for example. And that is a matter of national security. And because they're getting bigger and bigger and they have so much data, the government is concerned. What if there is going to be a backdoor, and what if the Chinese hackers will be able to hack some of these companies and get all of that data, for instance, right? So that's another reason why they want to break them up, so a single company won't have so much power over the data. Now, another thing is, of course, political influence. The bigger those companies are getting, the more influence they're going to have on the political stage. And that is something, of course, the government does not want to. There is always a war. Now, I'm not saying that they're not having any kind of power. Of course, they have money. They will lobby their people to the government in order to pass the laws that will benefit those companies out there, including Apple, oil companies, and every other company out there. But to a certain extent, they can get so big that the government won't be able to do anything. And the best example I can think about is Elon Musk. Now, Elon Musk purchased Twitter and he got so rich that he literally helped Donald Trump to become the president of the United States. Now, I don't want to discredit Trump for working hard to win this election, but I genuinely believe that if it wasn't for Elon Musk, who took his entire Twitter and put it behind the shoulders of Donald Trump might not be able to win this election. And that is something that the government is afraid, that those corporations are getting so big that they literally just control the entire government. Now, to a certain extent, of course, the corporations have so much influence in the United States, but now they're going to have so much influence that the government will have no influence over them, and they will be able to pass any laws out there. And that is something they are very extremely concerned. But if they break them up into little small companies, then the government is going to be so big for them, and the government is going to control them, and not vice versa. But in my personal opinion, it is very unlikely for them to be broken up. Of course, there are very strong reasons. Those antitrust investigations are happening behind the doors, and they're trying to break them up. But I believe, in my humble opinion, that is something that should not happen in the foreseeable future, because the US government does not want Chinese companies to overtake US companies. Because we live in a world where it's not just about the governments, it's more about the corporations that are controlling the world to a certain extent. So if US corporations have more influence outside the United States, that is an advantage to the US government. But if the US government is going to break down those companies and Chinese companies will overtake them, the Chinese influence is going to expand outside Chinese borders and the US influence will diminish. And that is something that the US government does not want to. So I believe that they will come to a certain type of an agreement in order to minimize their powers, but at the same time not break them up. But even that might not actually happen. A lot of this news is going to drive down their valuation, which will allow investors to buy those stocks at a fraction of their price and then just wait until that valuation will recover and they will profit out of it. Thanks guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.